Good. Well, welcome everybody to this event, particularly first of all, Welsh Minister Richard Mennin. Thank you for finding the time to spend with us this afternoon to discuss the issues that the report raises. And thank you to our exceptionally distinguished audience here, which is terrific. I hope that's going to enable us to have really a very high level conversation. It's not often we get to this particular group of people in a room together. So this is really a terrific opportunity for us to have a discussion, and we've got until about 5 o'clock to do so. So the event is really for the launch of the Policy Exchange Report, Untapped Potential. My name's Tom McCain, I should have said at the outset. I'm from WWF, and I'm here because WWF is sponsoring this event and provided the funding that made possible this report by Policy Exchange, which was written by Simon Ness. And this is part of WWF's ongoing programme of work to develop solutions to help us restore sustainable patterns of abstraction now and in the face of climate change and a growing population. And we're particularly enthused about a lot of the innovative thinking and innovative ideas that have come out of this report by Simon. Thank you. It's not going to be my job this afternoon to even start to explore what's in the report. So the format that we're going to have for the hour is that Richard is kindly going to kick us off by saying a few words. We're then going to hand over to Simon, who's going to spend about 10 minutes, he promised no more, taking us through the headlines and the key issues that the report raises. And that will then leave us with a good 3/4 of an hour, we hope, for questions, but also for an opportunity for a discussion. So I'm sure there will be questions for Simon and questions for Richard, but at the same time, given the very senior group of people we have here, we're keen to allow a broader discussion to develop. Now, the Minister's told us he may have to set off like Usain Bolt for a vote, but he will be back faster. So with that, thank you to Policy Exchange for hosting the event, and thank you to the Minister for coming to help launch this report.
Thank you, Tom. I will be brief because I want to give a chance to have a discussion about this. But first of all, thank you to Policy Exchange, because I was in at the birth of Policy Exchange with Nicholas Bowles and others, and when we were in some basement around the corner, we used to huddle around on just a very few chairs, and it's grown to become this great sort of instigator of ideas, and it's a privilege to be here and thinking about something very important, and to pay tribute to Simon, who I think has produced a very useful report, a very good one, and a very timely report, because our water white paper is coming up in the early winter or late autumn, whatever you call early December, and it will be the ideas in this are absolutely fundamental to what we'll be talking about in that water white paper, and so I'm delighted to have it on our desk and in the water white paper team's thinking. The water white paper will be our vision for securing sustainable water supplies right forward to 2050, and that's a fairly bold vision. Its basis remains the same as the basis of what I hope all responsible governments do in relation to water, the maintenance of public supplies, of public health, drinking water, proper disposal of water waste products, secure supplies for the public and for the wider economy, and of course to contribute to good quality environment, and that remains undiminished from previous years. But as Simon's report says, we have huge pressures facing us in government, and across industry and the environment. Pressures of climate change, with furthered by the increased demand from higher population and changing lifestyles. We have an existing abstraction regime and much of our supply and sewerage infrastructure, which is barely able to cope with what we need today, arguably doesn't cope with what we need today, and needs to be fit for the future. What is absolutely certain is that we can no longer take water for granted, and too often in the past we have. Climate change presents a real challenge, obviously, in terms of water availability. We now have shorter rainfall periods in winter, and this means the less recharging of aquifers at those crucial times. This means less groundwater available and more intense periods of rainfall the wrong time with greater runoff, and the current drought that we are focusing on at the moment really is a case in point. We're looking at the driest spring since 1990, but in the southeast of England and the central south of England, we've got the driest spring since records began. We are reliably informed that there will be a tenfold increase over the next 90 years of these kind of drought statistics, which basically means that we risk facing a 1975-1976 scenario almost every decade. And that is a really poignant thought on which to look at this report and look at how policy is created around this important area in the future. So the big one, the big issue to tackle as part of this is abstraction. The current system provides licenses that, in the main, don't respond to water availability. Rights remain constant, even if the level of water supply drops because of time of year or what's going on in the wider climate. Does this matter? Of course it matters. The problem is a subliminal one as much as a physical one of water quantity. The message it sends to abstractors is that they will be able to meet increased demand from the increased use of licenses. And therefore I really agree with the report that this is not a sustainable way forward in the future. Last month we published our Natural Environment White Paper, and in that we announced a reform of the water abstraction regime, and there will be more information on this in the Water White Paper. So we need your help to get these messages across. If you share my concern about this, this is your opportunity to influence policy and the way policy is taken forward, and that's clearly what Policy Exchange and Simon has done in this report. As well as the future problems, we have to meet current ones: unsustainable abstraction and the need to minimise further damage to our environment right now. And that's why I pay tribute to Tom and the work of the WWF in raising the issue through their Itchen project, through their Rivers on the Edge, and the vital importance of addressing the problems we face now as well as the ones leading into the future. And we are already taking significant steps through, for example, the Environment Agency's Restoring Sustainable Abstraction Programme and Ofwat's price review. Also, the water companies are investing to reduce unsustainable abstraction and to protect vulnerable environments. And I'm first to recognise that the scope to strengthen the Restoring Sustainable Abstraction Programme exists, and in the Water White Paper we will be looking at that. I also recognise that abstraction licence trading has potential to get maximum economic value out of available water. So it's really important that we address this. Since abstraction licence trading became possible, very few abstraction licences have been traded. The report, I think, shows that only 51 trades are recorded so far, so the barriers to trading, working closely with Ofwat, need to be looked at, and of course the Environment Agency has a key role to play as well in developing a package of measures to promote trading. A more competitive market will contribute to green economic growth and through greater choice and improved customer services. I want to pay tribute to the work WWF have done on the River Dart, and as I think it's outlined in this report, the value, the gains, not just environmentally, but the gains to the taxpayer, to the water customer, bill payers, my constituents, all of us, is massive if we understand the value of sustainable abstraction and how you can avoid spending huge amounts of money in other parts of the country in all our water catchments by just thinking carefully about how you approach abstraction. The Water White Paper will set out some of our thinking on increased competition in the water industry and also responses to the CAVE report. In February, the Secretary of State announced a lowering of the threshold for non-household customers who can switch supplier. Another 24,000 of those customers will be brought into a competitive market. The key to all our plans is to continue to attract a stable, low-cost flow of investment into the water sector. The water industry has benefited from £100 billion worth of investment over the last 20 years. We want to increase that because that means continuing good work on reducing leakages and work on reducing abstraction that has already taken place. And we want to, without that investment in the future, we will not be able to get to where we want to achieve. So we do want to give a message to the investor community that through this very important look at policy, where the government is taking a look at a holistic view across water policy, we do want to continue to see that flow of investment into our infrastructure, which will have huge environmental benefits as well. We know that metering is growing steadily, and this is important. The whole behavioural change in economics is massively important about trying to change the way people view water. Use of innovative tariffs. We do need to have a very strong message coming out of the white paper to look at affordability and how we protect vulnerable people. But those are just some thoughts about where we are and how this report sits in it. I'll just finish with where I feel very personally about this, and I'm sorry Simon and Tom have heard me say this before, but I live at the convergence of two chalk streams, the Kennet and the Pang. The Pang is one of the areas of low flow designated by the NRA back in the 1990s. I was involved in an environmental project about trying to restore that whole catchment and think holistically in terms of catchment conservation schemes. I've lived on and messed around beside and occasionally in the Kennet all my life, and I mind desperately at the state of that river and how it's declined in recent years, mainly due to abstraction, over-abstraction at its source. And also as an active farmer, I was always constantly aware that I farmed in what I was always told at the time, I've never actually seen it statistically proven, the second driest parish in England, the driest one being next door. And so, with a rainfall of sort of not that dissimilar to a sub-Saharan African country, and these really tough environmental swords of Damocles hanging over us, I know how important this subject is. And we have to look innovatively, we have to think broadly, we have to look at all the options going forward. And it requires government to be brave, but it requires sectoral interests to be brave as well. And I think that we can have a really useful policy process that will set us on course for a vision that I believe can take water policy forward to 2050 in a way that business, the environment, the customer, and everybody who's concerned about this important issue can have confidence in. But with those thoughts, I'll just sit down and listen to Simon, and I'll be very happy to answer your question.
Minister, thank you very much for that. Simon.
I'm Simon Less, and I'm the head of the Environment and Energy Unit here at Policy Exchange. And this is the first report on water that Policy Exchange has done. And the starting point, the way into this issue, was that over-abstraction is damaging the environment in this country at the moment. Some rivers are drying out completely at certain times, but actually when the water level in the river drops significantly, then that can cause damage through contaminants becoming more concentrated, rivers slowing down, warming up, silting up, and that can have costs for the insects, birds, animals, and plants in the environment. So this is an important problem. And just to, I don't know how well you can see that, but just to illustrate some of the scale of the problem, the map on the left shows those water bodies which are at risk from over-abstraction across England and Wales. And the darker the colour, the greater risk, but the dark and dark purple are at risk or probably at risk. And the right-hand map shows those areas which are over-abstracted in red, and those areas where if all the licensed volumes that were used, they too would be over-abstracted in orange, and that makes up about a third of all catchments in England and Wales. And on top of all that, as Richard's already mentioned, there are some major challenges which are likely to exacerbate the problem. These include population growth with a projected 70 million people in the UK by 2030. The modelled impacts from climate change, meaning, if they're right, drier summers and drier autumns. And coupled with all of that, increasing costs of supplying water as the cheapest sources are used up. We need to move to more expensive ones. So at the current rate of tackling the problem of over-abstraction, we've calculated that it will take decades, if not centuries, to deal with the existing problem of over-abstraction damaging rivers. And in the meantime, that damage continues, but not only that, there is also increased costs and an inefficient allocation of the water that is available, because the abstractors that hold licenses have a lot of uncertainty about whether they will be holding those licenses in future and are unable to trade them or to plan on the basis of having those licenses. And it seems that the key reason why progress is so slow is because it's likely to cost a lot of money to deal with this problem. And the costs arise, for example, from needing to build new reservoirs or new desalination plants or whatever in order to make good abstraction which you can no longer use. It's hard to estimate what that total cost will be, but there is an estimate that it could cost up to tens of billions of pounds under the current arrangements to fully deal with the problem of over-abstraction. Now, I'm going to build up this slide over the rest of the talk, so it looks a bit strange at the moment. The key to making better progress, this is the focus of the report, is to make it cheaper to match supply and demand in the water sector. And by making that cheaper, making it cheaper to deal with the problem of over-abstraction. And the key to making it cheaper is to look at the way that abstractions and water supply are regulated. Now, there are many aspects of the existing regulatory arrangements that are really a legacy from a period when the value of water was low, where we thought it was low at least. And the increasing scarcity of water, which I've talked about, and the increasing supply costs mean that the value of water is generally rising. It's becoming more valuable. And so it's worth having more sophisticated regulatory arrangements in order to incentivize abstraction, allocation, and consumption of water efficiently. Increasing overall values of water also means that the variability in the values of water becomes more important. And water scarcity is highly variable. It varies between different areas, and it also varies between different periods of time. And one of the most important aspects of this variability is those periods that where scarcity is highest, and these may last for only a few weeks or a few months, perhaps every decade or every quarter century, that actually drive a lot of the costs of water supply. So I'm going to highlight three of the approaches in the report to making it cheaper to deal with the problem of over-abstraction. These three. The first of these is to try to secure some cheap environmental wins. And one of the keys to this is recognizing that abstraction licenses, in fact, as already been said, abstraction license charges are fixed. So for an abstractor, the marginal cost for abstracting an extra litre of water zero. And the report makes the case that instead charges should reflect the volumes actually abstracted, but more than that, the structure of those charges should send signals about when abstraction sources are most environmentally sensitive, and also when they are actually at risk of damaging the environment. And in this way, where a water company has a choice between more than one abstraction source, they'd have incentives to use an environmentally damaging source, which might be cheap, a bit less often. And WWF has modelled this idea in the River Dart and found that the necessary differential in abstraction charges between two sources in order to alter the choice in that area such that the Dart would have been protected in the 95 drought was only about £75,000. And that compares with an alternative completely replacing the Dart abstraction source of perhaps up to £100 million. Now the second of the three approaches I want to draw out is the importance of increasing the range of options for matching supply and demand that are brought forward, and how we select between those options to get the cheapest way of doing it. Now at present, basically only the appointed monopoly water companies are able to propose options for matching supply and demand in their areas. And companies tend to favour capital-intensive supply infrastructure, and these can sometimes be quite expensive ways of dealing with scarcity periods that are very rare. The report proposes beginning to open up water supply markets in order to stimulate a wider range of innovative competing options for matching supply and demand. And one example of this would be to better enable neighbouring water companies to compete to supply water to each other and to each other's customers, where that's the cheapest option. Transporting water across companies' boundaries and transporting it further makes more sense in more places as water becomes more valuable. And in addition, I think Ofwat should consider reforms in relation to the regulatory incentives on water companies, including equalising incentives in relation to capital and operational expenditure and more incentives for innovation. And the third approach I'm going to pull out for making it cheaper to deal with over-abstraction is to reduce some of the demand peaks which drive a lot of the cost of matching supply and demand in water supply. And most domestic customers, as we know, remain unmetered. And even those that are metered face a flat rate charge per litre of water that they use. So this doesn't reflect the peaks and troughs in scarcity and supply costs of water. So, for example, based on the costs of Thames Water's desalination plant, a £200 million plant, the cost of running a garden sprinkler in a very dry summer period could be as much as £50 for a couple of hours. Far, far higher than the price that that customer using the sprinkler is facing. And this isn't just an issue of cost, but also fairness. Somebody watering a large garden in a very dry summer period is being heavily subsidised by other customers. Now, ideally, water tariffs would be better structured. They'd vary over time, sending signals about when there are periods of peak scarcity. So they'd be higher when water's scarce, and they'd be lower when water's plentiful. And this would incentivise demand to be reduced in precisely those periods which drive the expensive capital infrastructure investments, and precisely those periods where the environment was being damaged. And such peak and off-peak tariffs would be fairer. But to enable such structured tariffs, water metering would need to be smart enough. And I was surprised to find that companies are still installing dumb meters. And I think it's important that there are minimum standards for new water meters, and that the business cases which companies put forward for their metering strategies fully take into account the fact that smart meters can facilitate these improved, more sophisticated structured water tariffs. So my final area is to say that these ways of making it cheaper to deal with over-abstraction, They will hopefully make it cheaper, but they will not make it costless. And nor will the issue be dealt with automatically. The government will need to set a strategy and delivery framework for achieving sustainable abstraction. And I think a key part of this is the government committing to a timetable. Now that might be 15 years, it might be something else. And at the end of whatever the period is, there needs to be sanctions so that abstractors will know that they'll face high water charges, for example, if abstractions are still substantially damaging the environment. Now, setting this timetable would for the first time provide a clear destination to inform both abstractors and regulators' decision making. And timetable would incentivise water companies and other abstractors to engage in a process of identifying the investments which need to be made to reduce over-abstraction. And for water companies, that process which they need to engage in, I think, should be the periodic price reviews in 2014 and in 2019 particularly that Ofwat will run, where Ofwat can scrutinise the proposals, incentivise efficient investment and allow the funding necessary. So the ideas that I talked about, the further ideas of the report, are intended to inform the government's water white paper expected later this year in order to help end damaging over-abstraction. While this is the first policy exchange report on water, it isn't the last, and within only a matter of weeks I will be publishing our Policy Exchange's second report on water, and that will deal with the issue of competition in the retail services market in water. So just to cover that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good. Well, let's open up for questions and discussion to both Simon and the Minister. If people could just introduce themselves when they ask a question, that would be terrific. We always welcome discussion points as well as questions, whatever people feel minded to do so. Open it up to the floor.
Jerry Bryan, Underwater. I want to welcome in particular Simon's challenge to what is becoming conventional wisdom, which is that we can make managing our water effectively a cheaper option than it might otherwise be. There appears to be an emerging consensus that water is too cheap, and that actually what we need is a fairly blunt instrument, which is increasing the perceived cost of water across the board. And this is a very much more thoughtful approach. But I wonder, maybe this is a question for the Minister, whether our regulatory mechanisms are sufficiently fleet of foot, have the right resources within them to be able to tackle what I see as a very attractive and intelligent approach to the problem.
Well, I think it's a very good challenge, and Regina Finn may want to come in and talk about whether they feel able to. I think it's a very tricky thing for politicians to stand up, wanting to get re-elected as we occasionally do, to say you're not paying enough for some utility. What is interesting is in areas where it has a marginal effect, where I would state the Southwest, for example. And if you're on a low income there, you're much more aware of what your water bills are than in other parts of the country where they are considerably lower. And so the Southwest issue comes through the political mailbox and an agenda in a much more clear way. And people start looking at how they can change their household income by changing their behaviour. The corollary of that is for an economist to say, well, everyone else should pay more for their water, then they will use less. And that is a difficult one for politicians as a breed to get their heads around. And we're busily trying to create a more fair charging policy so people in certain areas are not paying way out of proportion to people elsewhere. I think what this report offers is the opportunity for us to have a very clear look at one of the major factors, which is damaging abstraction, and to try and get to a regime that recognises that when this regime was created, that we just simply didn't recognise those problems. And I think we're in that place. I think you're going to have to trust us to come up with something that's brave. But it's only part of the issue. And talk about competition and in the water industry, and everything is interrelated. And so, I hope that we'll be able to carry you with us through this.
Yes, I was going to say, Regina, it'd be terrific if you wanted to pitch in.
I'm happy to chip in. I just think, just to say, Simon, thanks very much. I think we're delighted to see the report and look at the work you've done on this, and we're happy to be working with you in some areas. I think the interesting thing about the question about do the regulatory environments have the right tools is that the challenge that I heard you give was to very much broader regulatory environment. So you talk about the regulatory environment for abstraction licensing, which of course is an Environment Agency issue. It's not an economic regulatory issue at present, but I would think, and I'm sure, and I know you're just thinking about this, that some of the tools that we're talking about don't exist in that framework. So the current pricing regime is set on administrative pricing, which doesn't reflect the value of water. So therefore the answer quite simply is no, it's not in there. And I know that that's very much on the Minister's agenda in terms of thinking about that broader regulatory environment. In terms of the economic regulatory environment, frankly, I think there are a lot of tools in there that we can use better. So Simon very clearly said, what about the issue between CapEx, OpEx bias? And we recently enough published a report on that perceived bias and what can be done to tackle it. So I think that is something where the tool exists, but we've been using the tools in a particular way and having to learn how to use it smarter. And I think the final area of the regulatory regime is, do we have the efficient regime within which to send signals to demand side, within which to reveal that value of water to the consumers and actually get better engagement. And I think that's where, as well, there are some tools that we do have and some that frankly I think we don't. And Richard already referred to Secretary of State's decision to broaden the scope for retail competition for businesses, which is a key tool in starting to drive behaviour at the demand side, which can then flow into other parts of that market. So I would suggest that I think Simon's been very frank and really helpful to this challenge to the three planks of the regulatory regime, if I can call it that. And I think there are some things where the tools do need refreshing, and there are some things where we as regulators need to use the tools differently. That's where we're contributing our part of the debate, wanting to use our tools to deliver more sustainable outcomes across the board. But I think this broader debate around the wider regulatory framework is incredibly important as the white paper is developed.
My name is Martin Cave from Lodesman Economics. I was very interested in what you had to say. I've always suspected that locational price differentiation is a lot easier than temporal price differentiation. And I wonder whether it's actually going to be feasible to take the incentive of prices that change by the seasons and by the time of day and so on, right down to consumers through smart metering or other means, just on the basis of water. I mean, I haven't read your document, of course, but have you made a case that the benefits from smart metering of water alone would be enough to justify the installation of them? I mean, the alternative, of course, is to use the variation in price at the wholesale level for transactions that take place between water companies. And that seems to me a much more feasible thing to do, because you aren't involved with 25 million households, you're involved with 90 water companies, 5 million rather.
The answer is no. I haven't done a cost-benefit analysis of whether smart metering can be justified on the basis of the benefits, and I think it will depend. It will depend on the area.
Well, I mean, the crux is you want to lump it in with electricity, because that's where the big gains are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there ought to be synergies between smart metering for a range of utilities, and I mean, the government's committed to smart metering for energy by 2019. What happens there ought to be compatible with what, if anything, is going to happen on smart metering for water. But to the extent that it costs, there's an additional cost to smart metering for water, I think it will depend on the scarcity of water and what options are available for supplying the demand in a given area. If water is really expensive to supply in a particular area, it could well make sense to really try to lock those demand peaks off and therefore reduce the need for that infrastructure, even if that's through a relatively expensive supply.
Thank you very much. Andrew Fallon from Moses Larkin Consultancy. Looking at the presentation, it seems to me the logic is you've got to match out, the premise is you've got to match out supply and demand. How do you do that? Well, abstraction isn't always the best way. And the logic of that to me would point towards water trading. I suppose the question to the Minister and to yourself, Simon, would be, how practical a solution, on the face of it sounds great, but how practical a solution do you see trading?
Well, we're very keen to say something very clear about bulk trading in the white paper, and if necessary to legislate to make it possible, more possible in the future, and touched on by Martin in his report. People come to me with all sorts of silver bullets. They say there's loads of water in the northwest and the west, and none in the southeast and east. Start planning now for an infrastructure grid, which they describe rather like they describe an electricity grid, which is of course an instantaneous and rather easy to transport commodity. Water is extremely expensive to transport, and it just the economics of some kind of thing on a UK scale. I know that in other countries they've developed this, and in some countries it has been a total disaster. But bulk trading does offer the ability to move water in a more environmentally coherent way and at a more economically sensible way as well. So we are very much looking into this, and there's been a lot of good work. I was just reading through a very good Nuffield scholarship on bulk trading, and which looked at a variety of different options and elsewhere in the world, and so we are very acute to this.
I mean, there's a number of different forms of trading could take. One is trading of the actual abstraction license from one abstractor to somebody else. I mean, at the moment, very little of that happens, and this is as you would expect from a regime where the Environment Agency applies a very large tax to anyone who decides to trade a license in an area, which is one of most of the areas where no licenses are available. And I was trying to look up the figure in the report, but I couldn't find it. I think it's about 65–70% of water that these few trades that have happened. 65% of the volume has been taken back by the Environment Agency, so that the recipient of the license ended up with much less water than the donor started with. So very little happens, but that's because the market is basically crushed. And whether that market would take off if the regulation changed, that's an open question. It may be more in some areas than others. So in East Anglia, in the summer, I think about 30% of the water is used for agriculture. So you could see in some years the scope for significant trading between, say, the agricultural sector and the water supply sector. In other areas of the country, farming is very low. So, where would the trading come from? Then there's the other form of trading, which the Minister's already talked about, which is trading through pipe networks that companies have between water company areas. And there, I think it's worth referring to a piece of work that Ofwat did a couple of years ago, which, albeit crudely, worked out how much could building new interconnectors between water company areas save compared to water companies' existing 25-year plans, and it worked out that perhaps up to £1 billion could be saved. £1 billion could be saved net NPV compared to water companies' plans for how they were going to meet the supply and demand balance.
On agricultural water resilience, I think there's a lot we can be doing to look at incentives that will encourage winter fill reservoirs and really joining up all our policies on the natural environment through the Natural Environment White Paper in terms of making sure that the Environment Agency, internal drainage boards, groups of farmers that are working together to achieve this, and you could actually have an enormous net gain. But at the moment, most farming businesses are looking at a sort of 30-year payback for if they're doing a straightforward transaction at current bank rates, and that's a big disincentive for anyone but a young, rich farmer. And so most of them are old and poor, and so we want to try and find economic incentives that would, particularly in the East, which would make that more feasible.
I think Regina wanted to say something about the trading issue.
Well, no, I think Simon articulated various forms of trading very well. I just wanted to ask Simon, particularly in relation to abstraction trading as opposed to bulk water trading. You talk about a longer term view and time horizons. One of the things when we've been looking at water trading, we looked abroad at various other places where this happens. And one of the things we found is that the point you made about certainty over the ability to trade and the right to trade is quite key. So in Australia, along the Murray-Darling Basin, farmers have an abstraction right, but it's not an absolute one. As it is here, is a percentage of the available water in the environment in a year. But they do have a property right to that, and therefore they have the willingness to trade it. In terms of the regime that we have here, do you have any comments on that aspect of it?
Yes. I referred right at the start of my talk to the huge uncertainty which abstractors currently have about their licenses and whether those will be taken away, and the DEFRA consulted in the previous government to time limit all licenses, so that increases the level of uncertainty. License holders are saying, well, hang on, so in 12 years we might not have any of these licenses. In those circumstances, you wouldn't expect to see much trading, because people are going to hoard their licenses in case they're reduced or eliminated in future. And I think it's very important that out of this process, much clearer property rights arise. Now those property rights might say on them, if water flow in the river falls, then your share of that river will fall. And this is the formula of how it will work. But at least that's a very well-defined thing, which can, that sort of risk, they've got some way of managing it, rather than a highly discretionary approach by a regulator who may or may not decide that your license is one that will be reduced or eliminated. And I think this is a big potential win for license holders. And this is one reason why I think that if a framework's put in place, a lot of water companies and other abstractors will want to engage with this process if it means that having had their licenses cut a bit, maybe had some new conditions put on those licenses, they then have much more certain property rights about the abstractions that they hold. That's a big win. They can start to trade that, they can plan and invest with much more confidence. So I think we need to unlock that benefit. And that of course, if that's a benefit, it should reduce the costs of the whole process, because there's a payoff there for the abstractors.
I might just sort of make a last comment on trading, which is actually sort of ties together the last two discussions about sort of peak water use and variability in trading, which is that a lot of the trading that happens internationally actually takes place not between sectors and not over permanent water rights, but is actually about irrigators trading water rights on an annual basis within big irrigation districts in North America or in Australia. And often what they're doing there is responding to variability differently. That if you've got a perennial crop, you know your marginal value of water is extraordinarily high, whereas if you're just planting annually, then you're quite happy to forego water for a year in return for relevant payment. So often what's going on are these spot payments quite locally to do with different people's response to variability. Now, in this country we can't really do that because individual companies or individuals don't hold water rights and they can trade with each other, they just get supplied by the company. So bringing in variable tariffs through the year is actually a mechanism that we have for trying to send the same kinds of signals that water trading does in other contexts around the world. So I think we need to sort of understand the context we're operating in, please.
I think it strikes me as there's two big issues here. One is the certainty that government can create around how much do we want to see abstracted and all of that. Because without that sort of certainty, then, or framework that Simon's talked about as well, then you aren't going to get the sort of behavioural changes that you want. But the other aspect to this is that, certainly to the extent I've looked at many of these issues, the payback on doing some of these things can be quite long, even if there are clear positive NPVs created by doing them. And the question is, how do you balance that need for certainty over, an 8 to 10 year or 15, 20 year payback by building in your pipe to do some water trading or whatever, with the uncertainties that exist within the questions. And there seems to me to be quite a real issue that exists within the regulatory framework at the moment, that we do not, for Scotland obviously, we do not think enough about longer term solutions. We don't think about things like asset rationalisation in the way that we probably should be. And the company responds inevitably to the signals that we give it as a regulator. So there seems to me to be a real question here about how do you get that sort of confidence into the company and the company's investors that they will want to engage in a programme like this. Because as Mrs. rightly said, certainly in the Wales context, cost of capital is critical. It's critical to create its public expenditure, but that's an equally at least short supply at the moment.
Simon, well, I think I might defer on that to one of the off-form people here if they want to comment on it, but it's certainly an issue, yes.
I spend a lot of my time when I'm talking about water is trying to reassure investors, and I'm absolutely convinced that we can produce through policy changes a product that is continues to be attractive to the kind of investor, the pension funds and such like that have invested in our assets and the infrastructure in recent decades. But you're absolutely right. So there is a concern, and there is concern, a misguided concern sometimes that the price review process just drives water companies to build great big nitrate stripping plants and such like, and that there is no incentive towards more nuanced approaches such as the River Dart and economic model and what's going on in places like Dartmoor and Scamp in the northwest, and this sort of upstream thinking. And actually, the last price review round proved that there is the mechanisms within the price review process to do that. We want to see more of that. We want to see more thinking that shows the stability of return as well. And you make an absolutely vital point about payback periods, and I think that's really important.
I think it's important to recognise that what investors want, investors recognise this problem. Investors recognise the same thing we're seeing here. They're not blind to the challenges the sector faces. What they want is sustainable returns. That means they want their money invested in sustainable assets. That means they don't want their money invested in great big desalination plants if they're the wrong thing. Because if they are then proven to be the wrong thing over time, the legitimacy of that investment is undermined. So they want to see the right investments. And I think the issue about return and incentives is not a new one for the regulatory regime. If you can incentivize somebody to build a reservoir with a 25-year, 30-year, 60-year, 100-year return, you can incentivize them to build an interconnector. You just have to align the incentives in the right way. And we're very seized on what for the need to do that, to align incentives to the sustainability objective. And Simon mentioned at the beginning the issue of, well, I won't build an interconnector, I'd rather build, say, a desalination plant and take water from a source in my own area, because there's a capex bias, because I get that on my RCV and I get a return on it, and if I build an interconnector and then mine water and that's OPEX and I don't get a return on it, so I don't have an incentive. That's the capex bias perception one example of where incentives really can be realigned. You can change those incentives, and that's a core part of Ofwat's future price limits consultation. And those incentives need to line up much more with the broader set of policies that the Ministry will obviously expand on in the Water White Paper, and those that other regulators put in place, like the Environment Agency around extraction, licensing, and use. So I think that we should be careful to point out that there's a lot of things that have worked very well in the regulatory regime in incentivising, something that's gotten us to a very good place. We can align those incentives to our future policy goals. That is completely possible, and it's certainly something that we want to work towards. And I know it's something that will be at the heart of the white paper as well.
Hello, my name is Swani Holbridge. The Minister will remember me from my days of working for Pharma, so I better declare an interest. As a London resident, I'm interested in the infrastructure issue, particularly the Thames Tunnel. And my question really is, does he have any comments on how to carry the public with government or with the authorities in making decisions about major infrastructure developments? The Minister mentioned that I'm sure everyone would agree there is a need for a replacement of existing infrastructure. But how do you inspire public confidence that the right decision is going to be taken, as increasing criticism that the Thames Water have come out with a super tunnel which may not work, is certainly, well, certainly going to be substantially more expensive than the current estimates. And boroughs like Hammersmith and Fulham, I think this morning, announced Lord Selborne's commission to look at alternative ways that might be greener, might be cheaper. If the government has said, right, Thames Water, get on with it, and then evidence comes forward that might not be the right decision, how is that going to be resolved?
It's rather relevant to my mind, actually, because we had a big meeting this morning in DEFRA about this with local authorities, with Thames Water, Ofwat, and the Environment Agency. So this is a massive scheme, and I approach it sceptically, which I think all ministers and politicians should. But I have yet to hear an alternative that I think that I'm informed that will work. We have currently one CSO overflowing every, I don't know how often it is, but it's going to happen 50 or 60 times a year, so basically once a week, and that is going to be very serious. We had 2 millimetres of rain recently, 19 millimetres of rain recently, which just after a drought resulted in CSOs releasing into the Thames, and we had a massive fish kill. And this really brings back to some of the points earlier, talking about how can we judge. We often think about in terms of rivers, in terms of where they are, whether they're low flow or high flow. But our understanding of what actually is the quality of that water is now so good. And one of the measures of success of this Thames scheme will be in the level of oxygen in the water at any particular time, and we can measure that at various different points, as well as the flow and the various other measures that make up that quality. So I think that this scheme has to be progressed. I think that there are question marks about its cost, but everybody who raises problems with it are absolutely right to do so. It's going to have an effect on residents, on the quality of life as certain areas are used for its construction if it goes ahead. But nobody can come forward to me with a horizon shift look at what is going to happen in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time with an iconic river in one of the major cities in the world. If we don't do something now, we could have a revolting river flowing through us with serious health hazards, and so I think that we need to progress it. But I think there's the other point here is about what the incentives we get through the system. There is a misconception that companies like Thames Water, desperate to do this because it's a big capex scheme and they can and it can look good at, through the way that they are judged. Actually, I don't think they or their want to do this. They'd much prefer that Bazalgette scheme suddenly developed another century of ability to cope with the problem. And if somebody can come up with a miracle solution, and I'm told that there are all kinds of cities in the world where they've found different suds and that they've suddenly developed separation of sewage and grey water and other schemes, but nobody can answer the questions to my satisfaction at this stage.
My name is Steve Podmore. I'm the founder of something called Transform Capital Management. I'm interested in where we are internationally on the best practice scale on both domestic and industrial consumption. And one of the things we heard before is about investor concern, but I actually don't think we've heard about investor responsibility. I actually think one of the biggest behavior modifiers for the institutional, well, for corporate and also for consumers. On consumers, it's about not just price signals, but on the industrial side, it's about responsible investment being taken seriously and policy actually being put in place that can actually drive that. It's only partially related, but Sad Miller, the head of sustainability for Sad Miller, talked about their water and sustainability, and not once has their finance director had any question leveled by an analyst on what are your sustainability practices. And I think the real challenge is, although many people feel innovation goes to this area, like you say, it doesn't. But if one looks at the 10 and 20-year risks, the risk to all corporates and therefore to our institutional investors comes from not addressing these issues seriously. And I believe this issue of using this lever is not addressed. I wonder what your thoughts are.
That's music to my ears, and very much the core of what we were talking about in the Natural Environment White Paper, where we were valuing natural capital, and the whole essence of resource management leading through to resilience in the Water White Paper will address this. But you're right. But businesses, we're ahead of government here. Companies such as Unilever, I mean Nestle now, have these kind of thinking right at the heart of what they're doing. They make a virtue of it, and their investors like the fact they're talking about it. Their shareholders recognise that there's a sustainability element to their economic model as well as their underlying impact on the environment. And right down to smaller businesses. I mean, Adnams Brewery can now produce a pint of beer using, I think, don't quote me, I think it's an eighth of the amount of water they were using before they built their new brewery. And so, we've got to play catch up. I mean, this is, for us, our shareholders, all of us, people.
Respectfully, I think that those examples are the exception rather than the rule, and I think the balance could be switched very quickly and dramatically with some focused public policy on responsible investment and investment reform along the lines of fiduciary duty, because it's not being taken seriously, although I'd like it to be.
Well, we want a really big push for this, and so any suggestions to the white paper about how we can incentivize business and through them investors to do that kind of best practice, I think is going to be really important. I don't think we should kid ourselves. I mean, ultimately, it's the economic return that will deliver the kind of sustainability we want if we take that in the right way.
Jerry Brown again. I think the Minister's comments on the Thames Tunnel actually feed back into some of what Simon's been saying. One of the problems with looking at alternatives to the Thames Tunnel is that economically it's seen as the removal of a problem. There is no value associated with the rainwater that is the cause of the problem. And yet London, as we know as a city, is short of water. Now, if the solution to the problem were open to competition rather than being the domain of the incumbent, and if the value of water, freshwater, rainwater captured and put into underground storage in the aquifer also had a value, then the economics, I think, would be very different. And we could start to look very much more carefully at localized schemes, upriver schemes, if you will, or upstream schemes for the separation of rainwater and for its removal into underground suds effectively, because that would have a value. The water that was then going into the aquifer and that would be available for public supply or deep irrigation would have a value, and that would have a tremendous impact on the economic analysis that, to my knowledge, at the moment discounts that value entirely. It's simply seen as a wastewater problem.
Well, I've seen an economic case for separation of sewerage and wastewater, which I don't remember figures, but it was a massive sum. And in terms of the concerns that some of the boroughs are raising about the impact of construction, pales into insignificance. So the retrofitting of sustainable drainage systems in throughout the capital. But if somebody can produce some piece of work that gives the lie to that, no one would be more happy than me. I want to find an alternative to spending £3.6 billion, and my constituents in Newbury will be paying for it, just as those of us who also live in London.
Good. Well, Minister, thank you very much for your time and your support for this project, and we're very grateful that you've been able to join us, and we're looking forward eagerly now to seeing it all come to fruition in the white paper in the late autumn. Thank you very much. Thank you, Simon, for your report.